When we've experienced narcissistic abuse, we most likely have survived traumas that shatter our mind, destroy our physical health, and make us question any connection to soul or a higher guiding principle. Most, if not all, mental therapies involve only healing of the mind, understanding and changing the way we think about our history. But unless that reaches the soul, we will remain mistrustful. Many people get stuck in mind, the mental plane, and assume they can think their way to healing. But thinking can be a clever guise of the ego, which is extremely fragmented, particularly after trauma. Many of us intellectualize as a mean to defend against feeling repressed pain. We just find labels to describe our pain, but never integrate our understanding, besides getting it mentally. Labels are validating, but don't necessarily guarantee complete healing. Most of us experience several dark nights of the soul, as our ego's plans are shattered and we reluctantly learn to surrender to trusting the unknown. It's extremely painful and humbling to endure betrayal and death of all that was familiar. It seems more accurate to describe it as dark night of the ego. It's when the rug's been swept from under our feet and we are forced to be patient and trust the process. A lot of normal behaviors have been pathologized. Anxiety and depression are something we automatically are prescribed a pill for. The ego wants, demands, and expects a quick fix so we can continue with our ego's plans, preferably without processing or integrating anything inconvenient or unpleasant. The pharmaceutical industry has now catered to this. But what if sadness and grief are part of a sacred process where we are meant to be initiated into a more humbler state of not knowing and are being led to trusting our soul? What if those quick fixes are interfering with our ability to grow in wisdom? Glancing at each updated version of the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders, makes you wonder whether humanity is healing and maturing, despite its technological advances, or whether we are becoming weaker and more dependent on an external big other with each passing generation. Labels have their time and place, but when traumatized people use a label as a permanent identity, it becomes restrictive. I'm mindful of using a label to describe a process. Labels presume we are static and therefore remain codependent and fragile. Healing isn't just horizontal, it's also vertical. What if mental symptoms are a manifestation of spiritual affliction? Over the years, I noticed a trend. People inadvertently became workshop junkies. Labels were provided which gave a temporary sense of relief, but then allowed the fragmented ego even further evidence of its victimization. The original intention of helping and raising awareness became distorted and attracted the perfect environment for covert narcissists to infiltrate. Discussions predominantly revolved around hate, blame, validation of private traumas that should never be aired publicly, and battles of comparisons of who had it worse. The lack of discretion was painfully evident, including the lack of emotional boundaries, let alone the ability to contain highly emotionally charged and intimate conversations. The victimhood movement exploded and contributed to even more secondary traumatization. People were and remained in pain, not seeing a way out of this fractured setting, which disabled them to make a paradigm shift. It's hard to accept that you will outgrow most people and situations the more committed you are to your healing. The circumstances of your life will change dramatically. This will be a reflection of the inner work you have done, the conditioning you've cleared up, the limiting beliefs you no longer choose to believe, the thoughts you no longer care to obsessively rehash in your mind. As you heal and learn more loving ways of being, you're no longer a match for the previously dysfunctional connections that attached you to your past trauma. And that's scary, but it's also great. It's challenging to see how much we want to control. Control issues are particularly arduous for people like us who were severely controlled by narcissists. It's a deeply ingrained pattern that causes a lot of unnecessary stress. What if your soul already has a perfect plan? Many of us lost connection to this inner knowing because of the pain we endured. Many people who survived childhood trauma also have very fragile egos. Our sense of identity never formed properly, so we struggle to find ourselves. Having a fragile sense of self makes us easily influenced and therefore prone to being exploited by manipulative personalities. You must find out who you are before demands, expectations, and obligations were put on you. Otherwise, you'll always feel vulnerable and like you need protection. We were all objectified, and our life served a pathetic meaning that was heartbreaking to become aware of. Being in relationship with a narcissist meant that your only purpose was to make them the orbit of your entire existence. You, as a separate self, did not exist. You were fused with them in nothing but a fantasy, delusion. The realization of all of this can trigger a crisis of meaning. And when you can no longer rely on another imperfect human being, isn't there meant to be something else? Something utterly dependable? Someone supposedly infallible? I remember being tormented by these types of questions. I didn't even know that I experienced spiritual abuse, and as a result, chose to disconnect from anything to do with God for many years. Spirituality or any discussion about consciousness was very triggering. I had a deep void and struggled to connect back to my heart. Healing is like climbing a stairway and slowly peeking out of the window and seeing a slightly different view of yourself, your life, your family, everything. The view on the ground floor is overwhelming and triggering. Everybody is engrossed in it. The second floor feels better than the ground floor because you see things that were not visible to you at the lower level. You gain some healthy distance, are able to emotionally detach and be less triggered. The higher you go, the more you see. The topics of conversation on level 1 versus level 5 are like night and day. Your interest in conflict drops. It starts to just sound like noise. And trying to convince those on the ground floor to realize what you have is impossible unless they too have done the inner work. This cannot be faked. You can only pretend to be at peace until a situation reveals your level of emotional mastery. They can't hear you and don't have the context to comprehend what you're trying to convey. In their frustration, they may attack you because that's what happens on the ground floor. There's very little discernment or self-restraint because it takes a quantum leap to make the transition from one limited way of perceiving to another way of knowing. A paradigm shift is required for us to rise above the ego's perspective because our ego has many rigid and automated defenses. Things look and sound very differently in one paradigm versus another. That's why there's so much confusion and battles in support groups. Everyone is talking from their own, mostly egoic perspective, from different levels of awareness and varying amounts of healing. They get triggered and are unable to perceive another person's perspective. Only victims crave external validation. Only the ego feels victimized and understandably requires justice and closure. However, for most of us, that will never happen. So where do we go from there? Who or what shall give us closure or the comfort our heart needs? Transcending or overcoming something essentially means we have gained or are gaining the capacity to be able to shift from one perspective to another. We are not locked into just one way of perceiving the circumstances of our life, but perhaps nobody has ever told you about these two paradigms. Our soul has wisdom the ego cannot comprehend. The more you connect to soul, the less you'll seek external validation. It's difficult to convey that to someone who's not receptive to it, who defends against it and wants to hold on in pain because they don't realize that this pain has become their identity. The fear of letting go of that identity is more frightening. For many people, their story has become their identity. And I understand many will not develop the capacity to transcend this status. I hope that's not you. I hope that your heart is signaling that it might be time to let go because holding on has become too painful.